Father God, I just thank you for this opportunity to speak about matters of human resources and being faithful witnesses before you and before others who might call us to account. I pray, Lord, that this would be illuminating and encouraging and that your word would go forth. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so a little bit of my personal background. As many of you know, I'm pastor here at Beavercreek Baptist Church and have been for just a little over 2 years. Before that, I served bivocationally and even in a volunteer basis at Fall Creek Church en Espanol in Indianapolis. I was in various roles over the 14 years that I was there, from volunteer worship leader to volunteer youth leader, associate pastor, and ultimately interim pastor during the COVID shutdowns, which was a very interesting and difficult time, not only in the church, but also in the workplace as well. During that time, when I was in Indianapolis, I was also working for the federal government for the Department of Defense. I also did a brief stint working as a civilian for the Army in Buffalo, New York. And totally, I have 14 years of federal civilian service. During that time in human resources, we were so large of an organization that we really broke out the human resources function into different areas. There was hiring, there was benefits, and then there was what I did, which was largely in the realm of performance and discipline issues. I also got to interpret and apply personnel policies whenever questions were asked or people needed to understand what their rights were. I was one of those people who was expected to know that and be able to give information as people needed it. But for the most part, I was dealing with supervisors and helping them deal with people problems. I was working in a very secular and bureaucratic workplace, and that presents a number of different challenges. One of the first challenges that I encountered in the workplace was that I worked with a very diverse cast of people. We had some who were extremely hostile to faith in general, some who were hostile to the Christian faith specifically, and at various times throughout my career, I had to deal with a number of different ethical questions or conundrums that would come up. And this was always prescient to me because the decisions that I made and the advice that I gave to supervisors could ultimately affect people's livelihoods. People could be suspended without pay. People could ultimately get fired. And not only that, they could get into so much trouble that they cannot come back to the federal government. So many of these decisions were important, they were challenging, and you wanted to make sure that you approach this in a very biblical and Christian way, if there is a Christian way, and I believe that there is. And throughout my time doing pastoral ministry on the one hand, as well as this human resources job on the other, I was looking for role models, and I was very happy to find one who was just a great example of administering under a government as well as being under a government, and that's why we are in the book of Daniel tonight. Daniel was a government official. He was actually press ganged into government service in Babylon. He had grown up with the nobility in Judea. When Babylon came and sacked the country, he and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were all taken and exiled over to Babylon and brought into essentially government service while they were there. I would like to read an extended passage, so I realize I'm taking up a big amount of my time by doing this, but I think it's important. Daniel chapter 1, we're going to read verses 1 through 16. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear the Lord, my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Today I'd like to talk to you about living by conviction. Living by conviction. And one of the first convictions that we should have, and that Brother Bill talked about during his session, is the fact that God is indeed sovereign over your circumstances. God is not surprised by the place that you are now in. He's not surprised by the workplace where you find yourself and the co-workers that you have around you. It says at the very beginning of this passage in Daniel that God gave King Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. This is not merely a euphemism. This is an actual statement of fact. God is the one who oversaw the handing over of the king of Judah into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And everything else that played out according to God's sovereign plan for the nation. The people went into exile. Daniel and his friends were in exile, and they went through a terrible ordeal. It is quite possible that Daniel and his friends, or at least many of the people that they would have known amongst the nobility, were forcibly made into eunuchs themselves. In other words, they would not be siring offspring. They would not be continuing their family line, which was so important to them in that day and age. It's a very terrible and difficult ordeal. You cannot imagine living through a siege, then having a conquering army come in and obliterate the people in the street. Seeing people dying of starvation is terrible enough, but then to see soldiers coming through and killing them, and then clapping people in irons and dragging them off on a months-long journey to a land that was not their own, speaking languages that they did not understand, it was quite a traumatic experience for everyone involved. And yet that also meant salvation for Daniel and his friends. Because the kingdom of Judah, or the vassal state of Judah, would be sacked again and again. And more people would die. Them being taken away in the exile, the prophet Ezekiel describes as a blessing. The prophet Jeremiah describes this as a blessing. The good people got out. They're thinking, oh no, we're suffering. We're going through the worst time imaginable. And Jeremiah says, oh no, it's about to get much worse. So God's sovereignty over this situation brought them into this land, and God was overseeing everything about their lives, as you can see from the rest of the book of Daniel. And what you need to understand and what you need to do is to trust God even in the midst of a difficult and challenging workplace. God has placed you there for a reason. It is according to his plan, and you have to trust that he knows what is good and that he is ultimately leading you, that he is indeed in control of your circumstances. And with that trust in God comes the ability to form convictions and to stand by those convictions, because faithfulness requires commitment, not convenience. You'll notice in verse 8 it says that, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Daniel would not defile himself. He was not willing that he would compromise on his convictions. He was not willing that he would become defiled by this pagan king and by the food that he offered to them. Now, it is possible that this related to the kosher laws of Israel, that they could not eat certain animals. They had to take certain precautions in the preparation of food. It is possible. It may also be simply that he would not break a vow that he had made to God. It is quite possible that he was fasting, only eating vegetables, as a sign of mourning over what had happened to his own nation. But regardless, Daniel had a conviction, and he was going to stand by it. He was resolved that he would stand by it. And this resolution that Daniel had was not contingent on God's favor. We see in the very next verse that God did indeed give Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, but that was not what Daniel needed in order to come to this resolution. And God's favor came as a gift, not as a reward for Daniel's efforts. God did not promise him that if you promise and you commit to not defiling yourself, I'll make things easy for you in the workplace. That was not a transaction. That was not a conversation that took place. And yes, Daniel certainly had some good people skills, but ultimately it is God's providence, it is God's favor that accounts for why Daniel is so successful in this situation. He can count on God, and God ultimately does come through for him. Now, when he first makes this request of the chief of the eunuchs to not have to eat this food, it says that the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. In other words, he got a no to his request. I do not want to eat this food, it would defile me. And the eunuch says, I'm so sorry, I can't allow that to happen, because if you start to look emaciated, if you start to look pale, it's going to reflect poorly on me in my job. And here, the highest punishment that they can deal out is not getting terminated. It is not being fired and told you can't come back. It is actually losing your head. So he's got a lot at stake in this, and he denies the request. It certainly seems reasonable because his life is on the line. But Daniel doesn't end right there. He doesn't say, well, okay, you said no, I guess I have to do what you said. No, what does he say in verse 12? Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Daniel makes a counter. He is willing to compromise, but without compromising on his convictions. And the question that does come up is, what would happen if the test resulted in a failure? We know from the passage that everything worked out fine in the end. But what would have happened if Daniel, after 10 days, the eunuch comes and looks at them, Ashpenaz comes and looks at them and says, I'm sorry, but you guys have lost a little bit of weight. You're not looking too good. You have to eat the king's food. Daniel was fortunate he didn't have to deal with that. But if you continue on reading in the book of Daniel, you'll find that the convictions of him and his friends is tested again and again. And at the fiery furnace, his three friends say, no, we are not going to bow down to your idol. We are not going to worship your gods. And they are cast into the fiery furnace. God saves them, but they had no idea what was going to happen when they stood by their convictions. Likewise, Daniel continues to pray to God even after it has been outlawed. It has been banned, so to speak, in the workplace. And Daniel continues to do it anyways in Daniel chapter 6. I am convinced, based on their behavior later on in the passage, that here what would have happened in Daniel chapter 1 is if they had started to look emaciated, and the chief eunuch came back and said, I'm sorry, but you have to start eating the king's food, I think they would have said, I'm sorry, but we're not doing it. And I say that based on this, one, their behavior, but also look at what he says at the end of verse 13. After these 10 days, look at us, check us out, see how we're doing. And then he says, and deal with your servants according to what you see. If he were speaking in today's day and age, he might use the same phrase that I used a number of times with a union president in Buffalo who continued to threaten to file unfair labor practice complaints or to make a grievance or do some other activity unless management would change what they were doing. And after some brief discussion, we would get to a point where he wouldn't change his mind and I wouldn't change mine. And I would see that the conversation was going nowhere, so I would say this line: all right, you do what you got to do. I'm going to do what I got to do. You do what you got to do. If you want to file an unfair labor practice, if you want to file a grievance, you go right ahead and do it. You do what you got to do. I'm going to do what I got to do. And I think that's what Daniel is saying here. Deal with your servants according to what you see. You do what you got to do. After 10 days, you do what you got to do, but we are not going to balk. We are not going to change our convictions here. So what are we to do with this? We have a short period of time, so I want to try to get this very applicational. The first off is you need to know what your convictions are. You need to become resolved. And that means deciding beforehand where you stand on certain issues that are likely to arise in your workplace. You have to decide up front, am I going to take resources that do not belong to me? Am I going to take a pen? Am I going to take a stack of copy paper? Am I going to take equipment back home from the workplace? You have to make that decision up front before the temptation or before the offer comes your way. Am I going to take time that does not belong to me? Am I going to leave at noon but clock out at 4 or 5? Am I going to write up my timesheet indicating that I worked overtime when in fact I left early? Or I came in late and I really only did work 8 hours. I just made sure I was here for that overtime period. Are you going to work on a Sunday? You have to decide up front, this is a conviction for me or it isn't. But you must make that decision beforehand. You must resolve. So that way when the trial comes, when the temptation comes, you already know what you're going to do and what you're not willing to do. In my own situation, I was administering HR policies in the federal government. If you have noticed, under certain administrations, those policies got very liberal. At one point, the Supreme Court decided that it was perfectly legal, it was fair, it was even equitable that we would have same-sex marriage in this country. And when you administer benefits to people based on whether or not they are married and whether or not they have children, you have to abide by those rules. And suddenly, FMLA benefits, Family Medical Leave Act, they now began to apply to people who were same-sex married. What are you going to do, HR professional, when somebody calls you and says, hey, my name is Bob, my husband Steve, he is going through this adoption process and we are going to be taking time off to adopt this child. What are my benefits? What are my rights? Well, for me, as an HR professional, on the one hand, I could say, in God's eyes, this marriage does not exist. But as it relates to policy and procedure, people who are over me, higher than me, have decided that these benefits that apply to opposite-sex married couples will also apply to so-called same-sex married couples, in which case I said, your benefits are such. I did not feel like I was violating my conscience by telling these same-sex couples that you could take this time off. These are your benefits. These are your entitlements. Not because God's word says it is so, but because this is our workplace policy. Another one that came up was the issue of the COVID vaccine. In our workplace, everyone was mandated to get the COVID vaccine. There were no mandates, there were no requirements that people get vaccines for measles, mumps, and malaria. There were no requirements that we have certain vaccines in order to work there, but suddenly this became a requirement in order to continue working for the federal government. And there were many people who were concerned about that. Does the government have the right to require me to get this vaccine? That's a challenging situation to come up with. Another one that came up, an ethical concern, was when a supervisor wanted to discipline an employee because she continued to annoy him and bother him. She was bothering him because her coworkers were making jokes and statements about the fact that, she really didn't look Chinese. And you would say, well, why would they say that? Why would they make that joke? Because her last name was a Chinese last name, and she was black. And that was because her husband was of Chinese extraction. She married him, took his last name, and her coworkers seemed to think it was very interesting that a black woman would have a traditionally Chinese last name. And they kept talking about it, and they made jokes about it, and it bothered her. And the supervisor was offended that she kept bothering him with this issue and told her she needed to grow a thicker skin. And can you help me write this person up? In that situation, one, he was violating EEO law, which says you cannot discriminate against people, and part of that is allowing harassment to continue. She is in a protected class, and I ultimately had to report him to his superiors. It was the only time in my career that I had to I had to turn in a supervisor for doing something that I deemed to be unethical and wrong. But I had that conviction. Secondly, you need to seek counsel. Daniel and his friends were united in their resolve. They were united that they were not going to defile themselves. This did not apply only to Daniel, even though he seems to be the spokesperson. And you should seek out godly counsel. Get biblical counsel from others, including your pastor. If you're dealing with an ethical consideration in the workplace, can I do this? Can I not do this? Talk to other Christians. You also should speak up for yourself, and part of that is knowing what your rights are. You do have protections against harassment, against discrimination, including harassment or discrimination that is based on your religious beliefs. Even if it is an off comment from your supervisor when you ask to take Good Friday off because you see that as a religious day and you want to observe it and take that day off of work. Oh, these people, they're only religious whenever the holidays come around. I've actually had people make those comments. Those comments are not acceptable within the workplace. It is a form of harassment or discrimination to even make such a comment about your employees. Know what your rights are. In reasonable accommodations, a very important Supreme Court case, Groff versus DeJoy, was decided in 2023 that said when people make a reasonable accommodation for a religious reason, the employer actually has to consider it. They have to consider alternatives. They have to discuss that with the employee rather than simply saying, I'm sorry, we can't do it. In that case, it was a postal worker who did not want to go make Amazon deliveries on Sundays because the Postal Service and Amazon had a deal that the Postal Service would make Sunday deliveries. He wanted Sundays off for rest and for worship. They flatly denied it. They didn't consider alternatives. They didn't listen to the options that the employee had brought forward. And they ultimately lost that case before the Supreme Court, who said, no, you actually have to consider, explore alternatives. Now, the end result may still have been that they could say, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate that, but they skipped the process in doing so. So speak up for yourself, know your rights, but don't go looking for a fight. Some convictions, however, will make conflict inevitable. I did wonder if there would come a point in time in my workplace when I would have to quit or be fired because of some issue relating to transgender ideology or LGBTQ issues. I was just waiting for a supervisor to put somebody next to me in the cubicle who was a woman identifying as a man and just see if they could try to agitate a situation. Fortunately, it never came up, but I was aware that it could. Sometimes your convictions will make conflict inevitable, but if they do, be polite, but also be confident. In Romans 12:18, it says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So far as it depends on you. And remember that you are always witnessing, even through exposure. We don't read that this eunuch ever converted like the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, but he was at least exposed to Daniel's faith. He did get a hint of who God is through the results in Daniel and his friends' lives. And I circle back to where we began, which is to trust in God. You do not know what the long-term impact of you simply living out your faith among your coworkers will be. But you need to do it, and you need to do it with conviction. Thank you.